And welcome to Developer Q&A. My name's Addison, one of our developer advocates on Miro's platform team. I'm here to talk through some of the app examples that we have currently on Miro's GitHub, specifically one of the NextJS OAuth setups that we have. If you're not familiar with OAuth, it's a way that you can authenticate yourself, so you can use services like Miro's REST API. And today we're going to look at how that plays into integrating with a front-end application, specifically with Next.js. If you are interested in taking a look at the example, we do have this currently on our GitHub under github.com/miroapp/app examples. You can head to the examples or head down to the README. And if we take a look under the Next.js OAuth under the REST API section, you'll see the example that we'll be using today. I've already cloned this example, so I have this running on my machine. So I'm going to switch over to it, which you can see right here. I'll make this a little bit bigger so we can take a look at what's going on. Let me also move this to the right. So Next.js is a front-end framework that we can build React applications for the web. This is already set up and has pretty much everything you need to go ahead and get started and start using your personal REST API token for Miro's REST API. You will want to install your dependencies after cloning this, so make sure you run yarn or npm so that you get all the needed node modules inside of here. What I'm going to do is take us through the different API routes that we have under the Pages API folder. These specifically are serverless functions provided to us by Next.js, which allow us to make server calls or basically create server routes in our front-end application that replicate an actual running server, so we can make calls to the different endpoints that Miro provides for authenticating ourselves in our API. I've already also installed the dependencies. As I mentioned, I have node modules here, and everything else should be in this project to get running. But I'll take us through it, and we can see this in action. One last thing that I want to point out is that we will see everything that we'll be using under the developers.miro.com under the REST API 2.0 section. So you also see getting started, the authorization flow. You can learn a little bit more about exactly what's going on behind the scenes and how to properly set this up and what to do after you authenticate your users. But this video is meant to take us through so we can see it in action and well, see how this works. So what I'm going to do is first run the script to start this project. So I'm going to run yarn start. You can also run yarn dev, which actually is what I'm going to do instead, so I can run our development server, because we're just going to be playing with this locally. So I'll run yarn dev. And because I have everything installed, this is going to fire up a running server on localhost 3000. So I'll click this. We'll open this up, and you'll see that we have just a little sign in button. That's all that there is going to be on this page. I'm also going to open up my console and my developer tools so we can see a little bit more about what's happening as we continue to use this. But essentially what's going to happen is when I click this button, it's going to make a request to Miro's authentication endpoint. It's going to exchange the necessary information it needs. We're going to sign into Miro using our Miro account, and it's going to return an authentication token specific to my user. Now that token that we're going to get back is going to be specific to whoever is signing in. So if you're following this along on your side, it's going to be your token. Or if you're developing this application for other people to use, when they sign in, it's going to be their own specific token. So what that means is access to the different boards and endpoints is going to be specific to what that user has access to from their auth token. Again, you can find a lot more information under our documentation under the authorization section under the REST API. But before I go ahead and sign in, I want to take us through the code so we can see in the code what process is actually happening behind the scenes, and then we'll give it a go and we'll take a look at what's going on. So we start at index.js. This is the file and the front end section that we see here. As I mentioned, we have this little link that says sign in. There are a few different pieces in React that we're using to set the state. We're using this, the use state to see if we're already authenticated. And we're also using use state to keep information about the current user that's signed in. Once we're signed in, we will basically get a response back from this authenticate endpoint. I'm going to show us what this is in just a minute, and that response is going to return true or false if we're signed in properly, if we're not signed in properly, and if we're signed in properly, we're also going to get the user information back that contains the name. That name is going to be used down here, so it will say hello. Well, whatever the user's name is, you logged in successfully, but this isn't even going to happen unless we sign in and authenticate ourselves properly. We're going to come back to this logic in the use effect, this API endpoint. What I want to focus on first is what happens when we first click this sign in button. So when we click the sign in button, it's going to, well, it's using NextJS link, and it's going to link us to one of our API routes /API/sign in. So let's head over there, which again is under pages, API, and anything inside this API folder is going to be a serverless function. So if I go to the sign in page, whatever happens when I go to this endpoint, it's going to redirect me to Miro's authentication server, or excuse me, authentication endpoint. We do need to provide it with a client ID and a redirect URL. These are things that you set up inside of your project. You will need to do this inside of your .env file here, but you can get this stuff from the application that you're setting up when you create a developer app. Again, if you're following along and you are interested in learning more about this, make sure you head over here and you should be able to get all of the necessary information like the client ID and also the redirect URL from this here. So after we go ahead and sign in, this link is actually going to bring us to a Miro modal. And we'll sign in properly on Miro's end. And once we sign in properly, it's going to automatically redirect us to this redirect URL. Now this redirect URL, in my case, is our redirect endpoint. So I have this coded again in my environment here. And if I open this up, this is where we really want to focus on what's going on. So after I get redirected from the sign-in page, I also have a code in the URL that I'm redirected from. So we can basically read this code from the query. So this code is a successful code that's returned from authenticating. And we're going to then call the authentication endpoint with that same client ID, the client secret from our project as well. Again, this is also something you get when you're creating a developer app. That code, and also, again, that redirect URL. Miro is not going to authenticate ourselves properly unless we provide all of the correct information in order. So that's how it knows that we're secure and that we're from the same application and we have the right credentials to basically continue on with the authentication process. We have a function called grab token, which is immediately fired after we hit this with the code. So we're not going to fire any of this code unless we actually have the code. What this does is it basically will post a response to this URL that we have defined up here. It's going to return a response that has both an access token and a refresh token. And what we're going to end up doing with that access token is setting this inside of the cookies. So basically we are first serializing it so we can read it inside of our browser cookies. And we're setting this access token and the refresh token. Now, the reason that we're doing this in the cookies is because this is just a demo application. At this stage, you can also do many other things. You can also store this inside of a database with your user's information. You can start to encrypt it and do a lot more information and things with this. But for, again, the demo purposes, we're just going to set it in the cookies. So for the duration of the session that we're currently browsing on and using, we can use this for the API requests in the future. And I'll show you this as we go along. The last endpoint that I want to show real quick is one last one called Authenticate. And essentially what this one does is make sure, this is an endpoint that we call every single time we hit a page or before we want to make a request. The reason that we're doing this is because we want to make sure that that access token is still valid so that we can actually have a valid access token to call the API. But we are also checking to see if there's a refresh token pair. Because if we do have an access token, but it's expired, we want to make sure that we can refresh that token for the user behind the scenes so they don't have to continuously log in. Access tokens are only valid for a limited amount of time, but if they do have a refresh token pair, you're able to do all of this behind the scenes, so the user won't have to log in constantly. Otherwise, that might be a little bit annoying, especially if they are in the same session and they are trying to use your application without any hindrance. We've left some comments as well in the code for the authenticate as well. So at first, what we're doing is checking the response coming through from the cookies to see if we have a access token and a refresh token. And if we have it, we are just going to say, yep, we're good to go. Continue on with your request. If we are not signed in, which means we don't have an access token or a refresh token, we're just going to say, hey, like you're not signed in, so let's not continue on with this request. And we're going to make the user basically sign in again. So this is if we don't have any of this stuff, we are going to make us sign in again. If we have a refresh token, but we do not have an access token, that means we would have signed in previously, but our access token is expired. And that's what when we're going to basically start the refresh token sign-in process again. We're going to behind the scenes refresh this token, which is using a very similar endpoint as the initial redirect sign-in endpoint. With the refresh token, more of the client secret and ID information, we're going to post to that URL and reset the cookie with the newly returned access token and refresh token. And then finally, make sure that we set the authentication state to true. And this is again going to fire automatically. So we're checking to see if we have the right stuff. And if we don't, we're refreshing it and then we're going on with the code. So let's take a look. Let's go through that one more time very quickly. We start here, we click this link. This is going to let us sign in. After we successfully sign in, it's going to redirect us to this redirect URL with a valid code. We're going to use that code to generate a access token and a refresh token and store those in the cookies. And any time that we basically load the page or make an API call, we're first going to authenticate ourselves. And that's going to make sure that we have, again, the refresh token and access token. So in this case, after we initially sign in, it's going to be true. But if not, it's going to sign us back in or make us sign back in because we wouldn't have had it or it would have expired. OK, let's take a look and see what this looks like in practice. So we're going to head to this example. I'm also going to head to the network tab so we can see what's returned. I'm going to click sign in. This is going to ask us to sign in. I'm just going to do my development team for now. I'll add it again. So this might say authenticate for the first time. And this is going to return the right information. So we are logged in successfully, as you see here. We don't have a name here yet, and I'm going to show us why we don't have a name here just yet. But if I take a look in my application, we take a look at the cookies, we have the Miro access token and refresh token. Cool, so we're signed in, we're good to go. And if we want to sign out, all we would need to do is make sure that we basically on sign out, delete these refresh and access tokens or make sure that they're not valid anymore afterwards. These are also by default with the code that we have set up, only valid for the session of the refresh token, and the access token is only valid for a limited set time. And again, that is based on what we have set right here inside of the max age, etc. So the reason that, and the last part of this is basically we're signed in, we have our access token, but what do we do next? We want to make a call to one of Miro's endpoints so we can get some information back. And we can use that information. It could be sending a sticky note to a board, or it could, in our case, be reading information about the user, which is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take information from the access token and find out who signed in. Again, it's kind of obvious because I signed in, so we're going to basically get my name from this API endpoint. The reason that this is not working is because inside of here, I have this commented out. This is not, I will mention this is not inside of the starter kit app example, but you will be able to recreate this in that project and build on top of it and follow along and get the same results. The first thing that I've done is create a new API route, which is called get user info. This is a very, very simple endpoint that's using the OAuth token endpoint. That's going to return basically user information. We can find it underneath here where we get to get access token information. And again, this endpoint is listed right up here. It's going to give us a lot of information like the team you're available from, who it's created by, and the scopes, but we're actually just interested in this user object and again, this name. You can get whatever you want, but again, I'm just using the name from this here. We're going to call this endpoint, and what we're basically doing is making sure when we call this endpoint, the headers that we're sending along with it have the correct authorization, and that authorization is the access token, which is being read from the cookies. We're going to make sure in our code that this endpoint is never called unless we have this access token, so this will always work. But there is a chance if you don't set up the code correctly inside of index whenever you're calling this, that basically you won't have the correct access token and it won't work. I'll show you what this looks like though, and how it does work in our case. Again, we're just getting the access token. This returns a response. We're going to read it, the JSON format of it, and then we're going to basically send that back to the place that's calling it. In our case, we are basically calling that from index.js. So we're fetching that endpoint, and then we're going to read the JSON format of that we sent back from right here. So now we have the actual data and information, and then we're going to set the user information in that use state that I declared up here before under the name key in our object. So we now will have a name inside of this. This is the important part as well. This is going to run when it's authenticated. So this is basically not going to run until this authenticate endpoint is hit, and we basically have a true state inside of here. And again, this authenticate endpoint takes care of all the logic to say, well, if our access token is invalid, make sure you generate a new one and send that back or set it in the cookies before continuing. So that's how we're going to know we will have a valid access token in this case. And then again, we're just basically seeing it here. Now going back, we now have the correct information because we basically are getting that from the access token. Now I want to show you what's going to happen if I delete this access token here from the cookies and I refresh. You're going to see that this actually continues to work even though we deleted that access token. And again, the reason that this is happening is because we're using this refresh token. We're using this refresh token to generate a new pair, and we're getting this. If we were to delete both of them, it should ask us to basically log in again because we don't have them. We can do it again very quickly. And then we have this user information. So again, this is a very quick demo on how to set up authentication or use the example that we already have with NextJS. And in our case, again, we are using an endpoint that we created on getting user information and using that access token in the headers from the cookies. But this could be anything. Again, this could be adding a sticky to a board. It could be used for admin purposes. There's a ton of different possibilities. And definitely check out the documentation in order to see what else you can do with Miro's REST API. And if you're creating a REST application and you want to use Next.js, using this app example is a pretty good place to start. Thank you, though, for joining in and having a look, and hopefully you learned something new. And if you're interested in joining and learning a little bit more, make sure that you join us in our community. We run this developer Q&A session every week on Wednesdays at 5:30 Central European Summertime or Central European Time, depending on what time of the year it is. And make sure you check out our community page, which we have a lot more information on what we're doing for our developer community. And if you are interested as well, make sure you sign up for our developer newsletter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.